March 27, 1941, Honolulu Harbor, territory of Hawaii. Takeo Yoshikawa stood on the deck of the passenger ship Nitamaru as it approached the Honolulu docks, watching the city materialize through the tropical haze. He was 29 years old, wore civilian clothes that didn't quite fit his military bearing, and carried papers identifying him as Tadashi Morimura, a minor consular official being assigned to the Japanese consulate in Honolulu as vice consul. The papers were false. The name was false. The civilian identity was false. Everything about Tadashi Morimura was a carefully constructed lie designed to conceal the truth, that Takeo Yoshikawa was a trained naval intelligence officer on what would become the most consequential espionage mission of World War II. Yoshikawa's mission was simple to state but extraordinarily difficult and dangerous to execute. Gather complete intelligence on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Determine ship positions, fleet composition, defensive capabilities, operational patterns, security measures. Document everything that would enable the Imperial Japanese Navy to plan and execute a surprise attack that would cripple American naval power in the Pacific. He would operate completely alone, without agents or support network, because using local Japanese Americans as spies would be both morally repugnant to Yoshikawa and tactically foolish. Any network could be penetrated, and he couldn't risk compromising his mission. He would have no weapons, no communication equipment beyond the consulate's cables, no escape plan if discovered. If American counterintelligence identified him as a spy, he would be arrested and likely executed. And he would have approximately 8 months to gather the intelligence needed for an attack that was being planned in Tokyo, but that he knew almost nothing about. He didn't know when the attack would come, or even if it would definitely happen. He only knew that his mission was to provide Japanese naval planners with the information they needed to make such an attack possible and successful. As Yoshikawa watched American customs officials prepare to board the Nitamaru, he felt the weight of his mission settle onto his shoulders. He was about to begin the most important work of his life, work that would enable an attack that would kill thousands and plunge the world deeper into war. He had been trained for this, had been preparing for years. But training and actual operations were different. Now there was no going back. The American customs inspection was cursory. Tadashi Morimura was just another minor Japanese diplomat among hundreds stationed in Hawaii, where the large Japanese population meant the consulate was substantial. The Americans noted his arrival, stamped his papers, and allowed him to disembark. Within hours, Yoshikawa was at the Japanese consulate on Nuuanu Avenue, being introduced to Consul General Nagao Kita as the new vice consul who would handle consular affairs. Kita knew Yoshikawa's real identity and mission. Someone at the consulate had to know, to provide cover and communication channels. But the rest of the consulate staff believed Morimura was exactly what he claimed to be, a junior diplomat handling routine paperwork. This isolation was necessary for security but meant Yoshikawa would operate with no support, no one he could discuss his work with, no assistance if things went wrong. Yoshikawa spent his first week in Hawaii simply observing and getting oriented. He needed to understand the city, needed to develop routines that wouldn't attract attention, needed to identify observation points from which he could watch Pearl Harbor without being obvious about it. He needed to become invisible. Just another Japanese civilian in a city where thousands of Japanese and Japanese Americans lived and worked. His background had prepared him well for this mission, though in unexpected ways. Yoshikawa had grown up in a military family, had entered the Japanese Naval Academy planning a career as a naval officer. But illness forced his resignation from active service before he could command ships. Rather than abandoning military service entirely, he had transferred to naval intelligence, where his knowledge of naval operations combined with language skills and analytical abilities made him valuable. For 3 years before his Hawaii assignment, Yoshikawa studied at the Naval Intelligence School, learning espionage tradecraft, practicing surveillance techniques, studying American naval capabilities and procedures. He learned to memorize complex information without taking notes that could be discovered. He learned to observe without appearing to observe, to blend into civilian environments despite military training that made him naturally stand out. Most importantly, he learned patience, Intelligence work wasn't dramatic or heroic. It was methodical, careful, often boring. It was watching the same location day after day, noting patterns, documenting changes, building comprehensive understanding through accumulation of small details. It was resisting the temptation to take risks for quick results, accepting that good intelligence took time to develop. Now, in Hawaii in spring 1941, Yoshikawa applied everything he had learned. His cover as a consular official gave him legitimate reasons to move around Honolulu, to interact with the Japanese community, to travel around Oahu. Japanese diplomats weren't particularly restricted. Relations between the United States and Japan were tense but not yet hostile, and diplomats enjoyed the usual courtesies. Yoshikawa began developing routines. He would take the bus to different parts of Oahu, always appearing to be sightseeing or conducting routine consular business. He would visit Japanese restaurants and shops, maintaining the appearance of a diplomat staying connected with the community he served. And he would find reasons to be near Pearl Harbor, the massive naval base that was home to the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Pearl Harbor in 1941 was the most important American naval base in the Pacific. It was home to battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, nearly the entire combat power of the Pacific Fleet. The base had been developed over decades, with extensive facilities for repair, resupply, and maintenance. Ships based at Pearl Harbor could operate throughout the Pacific, projecting American power across vast distances. The base was also, from a security perspective, remarkably open. This was peacetime, and while tensions with Japan were increasing, war seemed unlikely to most Americans. The base had security measures, guards at gates, restricted areas, classified operations, but it wasn't locked down as a facility expecting attack would be. Civilians could get relatively close to base perimeters. Observation points existed from which much of the harbor could be seen. Yoshikawa systematically identified and exploited these observation points. There was a restaurant called Shuncho Ro on Aliwa Heights that provided excellent views of the harbor. He would eat lunch there several times a week, sitting by the window, appearing to enjoy his meal while actually counting ships, noting their positions, observing their movements. The staff thought he was a regular customer who liked the view. He was actually conducting systematic surveillance. There were public roads that ran near the base perimeter. Yoshikawa would take buses along these roads, sitting by windows, observing through the fence line, noting security measures and ship positions. He would visit beaches near the base, appearing to swim and relax while actually studying underwater obstacles and defensive positions. His most audacious surveillance involved hiring civilian pilots to take him on sightseeing flights around Oahu. These flights would pass near or over military installations, and Yoshikawa would observe from the air, getting perspectives on base layout and ship positions that ground-based observation couldn't provide. The pilots thought they were taking a Japanese diplomat on tourist flights. Yoshikawa was conducting aerial reconnaissance. One persistent story, which Yoshikawa himself recounted in later interviews, involved swimming in Pearl Harbor itself. According to his account, he would swim near the harbor entrance wearing a diving mask, using a hollow reed to breathe while observing underwater obstacles and anti-submarine nets. This story has been disputed by some historians who note that security around the harbor entrance was tighter than this would suggest, but Yoshikawa insisted it was true, and that he discovered the crucial fact that Pearl Harbor had no anti-torpedo netting protecting the ships. Whether or not the swimming story was accurate in all details, Yoshikawa definitely discovered that Pearl Harbor lacked anti-torpedo netting. This was a critical piece of intelligence. Torpedoes dropped by aircraft normally required deep water, at least 75 feet, to dive after release before leveling out for their run to target. Pearl Harbor was much shallower, averaging only 40 feet in many areas. Standard torpedoes would hit bottom before leveling out. But if the Americans had no anti-torpedo nets protecting their ships, then Japanese engineers could develop torpedoes modified to run in shallow water, torpedoes that could be used at Pearl Harbor. Yoshikawa's intelligence on the absence of torpedo nets directly influenced Japanese development of shallow-running torpedoes that would prove devastatingly effective on December 7th. Beyond physical surveillance, Yoshikawa gathered intelligence through conversation and observation of American behavior. He talked with Japanese Americans who worked at Pearl Harbor in civilian capacities, carefully gathering information without revealing his intelligence purpose. He read local newspapers, which published stories about fleet movements and exercises with details that would never have been published in wartime. He observed American servicemen in bars and restaurants, noting their casual discussion of operational matters that should have been kept quiet. What Yoshikawa discovered was that American security culture in Hawaii was remarkably lax. Servicemen talked openly about ship movements and schedules. Newspapers published information about fleet exercises and port visits. Civilians could get close enough to bases to observe significant details. The Americans seemed to believe that war with Japan was unlikely, and that even if it came, it would be fought in the Western Pacific, not at Pearl Harbor. This complacency was the foundation on which Japanese attack planning would be built. If Pearl Harbor had been on high alert, if security had been tight, if the Americans had believed attack was imminent, Yoshikawa's mission would have been far more difficult, and the attack itself might have failed. But American commanders in Hawaii didn't believe attack was likely, and their security posture reflected that assumption. Yoshikawa sent his intelligence to Tokyo through coded cables transmitted by the consulate. Several times per week, he would prepare reports summarizing what he had observed, which ships were in harbor, where they were berthed, what security measures were present, what changes had occurred since his last report. These reports were encoded using Japanese diplomatic ciphers and transmitted to the Foreign Ministry in Tokyo, which forwarded them to naval intelligence. The American government was reading some of these cables. American cryptographers had broken some Japanese diplomatic codes through a program called Magic, but the codes Yoshikawa's reports used weren't always broken. And even when they were, the sheer volume of diplomatic traffic between Tokyo and its consulates worldwide meant that not every message was translated and analyzed immediately. Some of Yoshikawa's reports were read by American intelligence, but their significance wasn't recognized. Others weren't decrypted until after Pearl Harbor, when it was too late to matter. By summer 1941, Yoshikawa had developed comprehensive intelligence on Pearl Harbor. He knew the harbor's layout, the typical berthing positions for different ship types, the weekly and monthly patterns of fleet movements. He knew that aircraft carriers usually put to sea for exercises while battleships remained in port more often. He knew where anti-aircraft defenses were positioned, what alert states the base maintained, how many aircraft were stationed at nearby airfields. In Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was using Yoshikawa's intelligence to plan an attack that would be unprecedented in naval history, a carrier-based airstrike across thousands of miles of ocean to destroy the American Pacific Fleet in its home base. The plan was audacious, risky, and entirely dependent on surprise. If the Americans detected the approaching Japanese fleet, if they had warning and time to prepare, the attack would fail and might result in catastrophic Japanese losses. But Yamamoto believed the attack could succeed if executed with perfect surprise and perfect intelligence. Yoshikawa was providing the intelligence. The Japanese fleet would provide the surprise through operational security and careful routing that avoided American patrol zones. In September 1941, Yoshikawa received a message from Tokyo requesting specific information needed for final attack planning. The request came in the form of 97 detailed questions about Pearl Harbor, the depth of water in different areas, the positions of oil storage tanks, the locations of aircraft hangars, the exact distances between different facilities. The questions revealed sophisticated operational planning, and Yoshikawa recognized that an attack was being prepared in detail. Over the following weeks, Yoshikawa worked to answer every question. He conducted additional surveillance, took additional risks to gather needed details, verified information through multiple observations. He prepared responses that were as accurate and comprehensive as possible, knowing that men would die based on the quality of his intelligence. He felt the weight of that responsibility but didn't let it interfere with his work. His duty was to provide accurate intelligence. What his government did with that intelligence was not his decision to make. By November 1941, relations between the United States and Japan had deteriorated severely. American economic sanctions, particularly oil embargoes, were strangling Japanese war efforts in China. Diplomatic negotiations were deadlocked. Both sides were preparing for possible war, though neither had yet committed to it definitively. In this tense atmosphere, Yoshikawa increased the frequency of his surveillance and reporting. He knew that if war came, it would likely begin soon. Japan couldn't sustain military operations indefinitely without oil, and American sanctions meant oil supplies were running out. If Japan was going to fight, it had to act before fuel exhaustion forced surrender or humiliating negotiation. On December 2, 1941, Yoshikawa received a message from Tokyo with a final intelligence request. The message asked for immediate, detailed information on exactly which ships were in Pearl Harbor, precisely where they were berthed, what their condition was when they were scheduled to move. The specificity and urgency of the request made clear that an attack was imminent. Yoshikawa conducted final surveillance on December 5th and 6th. He visited his usual observation points, counted ships, noted positions, confirmed that the American alert status remained at peacetime norms. He prepared a final report that documented everything Japanese attack planners needed to know. The report noted that 8 battleships were in harbor, along with numerous cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels. Critically, the aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were at sea or in stateside ports not present at Pearl Harbor. This was unfortunate from the Japanese perspective, as carriers were higher priority targets than battleships. But the battleships alone represented enormous combat power, and their destruction would cripple the Pacific Fleet. The report also confirmed that American defenses remained at low alert. Anti-aircraft batteries weren't fully manned. Fighter aircraft were parked in neat rows on airfield tarmac, easy targets rather than dispersed. Reconnaissance patrols were limited. Pearl Harbor was not expecting attack. Yoshikawa encoded his final report and transmitted it through consulate channels on December 6th. Hours later, the report was being read by Admiral Yamamoto aboard the flagship Nagato. The intelligence confirmed that conditions were ideal for attack. The American fleet was concentrated in harbor, was unprepared, and could be struck with surprise. The Japanese carrier strike force, which had sailed from Japan in complete radio silence 2 weeks earlier, was now approaching Hawaiian waters from the north. 6 aircraft carriers with over 400 aircraft were positioning for dawn launch on December 7th. Yoshikawa's intelligence had enabled planning for this attack, had provided the detailed information that allowed Japanese planners to develop tactics and identify targets, had confirmed that conditions favored surprise. On the evening of December 6th, Yoshikawa went to bed in his modest apartment near the consulate, knowing that the next day would change everything. He didn't know exactly when the attack would come. That information was too sensitive to be shared with someone operating under diplomatic cover in enemy territory. But he knew it would be soon, probably within days, possibly within hours. Early on the morning of December 7, 1941, Yoshikawa was awakened by the sound of explosions. He rushed to the consulate, climbed to the roof, and watched as Japanese aircraft swarmed over Pearl Harbor, dropping bombs and torpedoes on the American fleet. The attack had begun at 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time. Yoshikawa watched as battleships exploded, as the Arizona erupted in catastrophic detonation, as ships burned and capsized while American defenders scrambled to respond. The attack lasted approximately 2 hours. When it ended, 8 American battleships had been sunk or damaged, over 180 aircraft had been destroyed on the ground, and over 2,400 Americans were dead. The U.S. Pacific Fleet had been crippled in a single morning. The surprise had been complete. Japanese losses were minimal: 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, fewer than 100 men. From a military perspective, the attack was a tactical triumph, a perfectly executed surprise attack that achieved its objectives at minimal cost. And that tactical triumph had been enabled by Yoshikawa's intelligence work over the preceding 8 months. His surveillance had provided the information that made detailed planning possible. His reporting had confirmed that conditions favored surprise. His final messages had given Japanese commanders confidence to proceed with an operation that was risky, but that Yoshikawa's intelligence suggested could succeed. Takeo Yoshikawa had completed his mission perfectly. He had gathered the intelligence required, had transmitted it to Tokyo, had enabled an attack that changed the course of the Pacific War. He was one of the most successful intelligence operatives of World War II, having accomplished exactly what he was sent to accomplish without being detected or compromised. But success came with a price that Yoshikawa would spend the rest of his life paying. The hours and days following the Pearl Harbor attack were among the most dangerous of Yoshikawa's life. As smoke still rose from the burning ships in the harbor, American authorities moved swiftly to round up Japanese nationals suspected of espionage or sabotage. FBI agents, military intelligence officers, and local police began arresting Japanese consular officials, community leaders, and anyone else who might have contributed to the attack. Yoshikawa remained at the Japanese consulate, which American authorities had immediately surrounded with armed guards. The consulate staff, including Consul General Kita and all the diplomats, were confined to the building. American authorities were furious, shocked by the attack, and determined to identify everyone who had facilitated it. In the immediate chaos after the attack, Yoshikawa took a crucial step that would ultimately save his life. He burned all his personal intelligence notes and documents. He had maintained coded notebooks with ship observations, hand-drawn maps of Pearl Harbor, notes on American defensive positions. All of this was evidence that would have identified him as the spy who enabled the attack. All of it went into the consulate's furnace and burned to ash. When FBI agents entered the consulate later on December 7th, conducting searches and interrogations, they found diplomatic correspondence and routine consular paperwork. They found nothing that specifically identified Yoshikawa as an intelligence operative. His cover as Tadashi Morimura, minor vice consul, held up under initial scrutiny. The American investigators questioned everyone at the consulate repeatedly over the following days. They were certain that someone at the consulate had been gathering intelligence on Pearl Harbor. The precision of the Japanese attack made that obvious, but they couldn't definitively prove who it was. Multiple consular officials had legitimate reasons to travel around Oahu. Several had been seen near Pearl Harbor. Without concrete evidence, American authorities couldn't single out the specific person responsible. Yoshikawa's interrogations were tense. FBI agents suspected him. His age and military bearing suggested he might be more than he claimed, but Morimura maintained his cover story consistently. He was a low-level diplomat who handled routine consular affairs. He had done some sightseeing around Oahu because he enjoyed the scenery. He had visited restaurants with harbor views because the food was good. He had taken plane rides because he was interested in aviation. Everything he had done had plausible, innocent explanations. The Americans couldn't break him. Without his burned notes, without witnesses who could testify that he had been gathering intelligence rather than sightseeing, without intercepted communications that explicitly revealed his mission, most of his cables hadn't been decrypted. They couldn't prove he was a spy. In accordance with international law regarding diplomatic personnel, even those from enemy nations, the United States couldn't simply execute suspected spies who held diplomatic credentials without trial and evidence. Doing so would have violated diplomatic conventions and potentially endangered American diplomats in Japanese custody. Instead, Japanese diplomatic personnel from Hawaii and from the mainland United States were rounded up and held for eventual exchange. In summer 1942, Yoshikawa and hundreds of other Japanese diplomats and their families were repatriated to Japan via neutral ships in exchange for American diplomats who had been in Japan when war began. Yoshikawa arrived back in Japan in August 1942, 8 months after Pearl Harbor. He expected to be celebrated as a hero, to receive recognition for the intelligence work that had enabled Japan's greatest military triumph. Instead, he encountered something far different: official silence and personal obscurity. The Japanese government classified Yoshikawa's identity and role as top secret. They didn't want Americans to know specifically who had been the Pearl Harbor spy. That information might help American counterintelligence understand how Japanese espionage operated. More importantly, the government didn't want to acknowledge that the Pearl Harbor attack had been facilitated by espionage. Official Japanese propaganda portrayed the attack as a purely military operation, a brilliant strike by the Imperial Navy. Acknowledging that the attack had required 8 months of detailed espionage by a single spy undermined that narrative. So Yoshikawa's role remained classified. He was debriefed by naval intelligence. His reports were filed, and he was essentially told to disappear into civilian life and never discuss his Hawaii mission. He received no public recognition, no award ceremony, no promotion. His family didn't know what he had done. The Japanese public, celebrating Pearl Harbor as a great victory, didn't know that a young intelligence officer's work had made that victory possible. Yoshikawa was assigned to various minor intelligence positions through the rest of the war, but his career never advanced significantly. He ended the war as a relatively junior officer, his most important accomplishment officially secret, his contribution to Japan's brief moment of military success unacknowledged. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Yoshikawa's situation became even more complicated. The American occupation authorities were hunting for war criminals, people responsible for atrocities, aggressive war planning, violations of international law. Intelligence operatives who had facilitated attacks like Pearl Harbor potentially fell into categories that could be prosecuted. Yoshikawa lived in fear that American authorities would eventually identify him as the Pearl Harbor spy and would arrest him for war crimes. He had destroyed the evidence in 1941, and the Americans had never definitively proven his role. But with post-war access to Japanese military records, American investigators might eventually connect Tadashi Morimura to Takeo Yoshikawa and realized they had had the Pearl Harbor spy in custody in 1941-42, but had released him. Remarkably, this never happened. American occupation authorities either never made the connection or decided that intelligence gathering, even intelligence that enabled the Pearl Harbor attack, wasn't a war crime. Spying was considered a legitimate military activity. The attack itself, while controversial because it came before a formal declaration of war, wasn't prosecuted as a war crime. Japanese leaders were tried for atrocities and aggressive war planning, but the Pearl Harbor attack itself wasn't among the charges at the Tokyo war crimes trials. Yoshikawa was never arrested, never questioned about his wartime activities, never charged with anything. He simply melted into post-war Japanese society as millions of veterans did, trying to survive in a defeated and occupied country. But survival in post-war Japan was difficult. The country was devastated, cities bombed to rubble, economy collapsed, population traumatized by defeat and occupation. Jobs were scarce, particularly for former military officers who were considered tainted by their association with the defeated regime. Yoshikawa struggled economically through the late 1940s and 1950s. He worked various menial jobs, including, according to some accounts, driving a taxi in Tokyo. The man whose intelligence work had enabled Japan's greatest military victory was driving a cab to feed his family, his accomplishments unknown and unacknowledged. His marriage suffered. His wife, who had married a promising young officer, found herself married to a man who couldn't provide adequate support, who couldn't explain what he had done during the war because it remained classified, who seemed to have no prospects. They eventually divorced, another casualty of war's long aftermath. Through the 1950s, Yoshikawa remained silent about his Pearl Harbor role. The Japanese government continued to classify his identity as secret. He had been trained to keep secrets, and he kept this one even though it cost him personally. But in the early 1960s, as memories of the war began to fade and as historical research into Pearl Harbor intensified, American researchers began piecing together who had been the Japanese spy in Hawaii. Journalists investigated, interviewed former consulate staff, examined declassified documents. By the mid-1960s, American researchers had identified Takeo Yoshikawa as the Pearl Harbor spy. When this information was published in American books and articles, the Japanese government's secrecy became pointless. Yoshikawa's identity was now public, and with that publicity came renewed interest in his story, both in Japan and internationally. In 1960, Yoshikawa agreed to be interviewed for the first time, speaking with American journalist Gordon Prangs, who was researching a comprehensive history of Pearl Harbor. Yoshikawa was still cautious, still protective of some operational details, but he confirmed his identity and provided basic information about his mission. The interview led to more interviews. Japanese publications wanted his story. American historians sought his perspective. Television documentaries were produced featuring Yoshikawa describing his espionage work. His story began to emerge fully: how he had been trained, how he had conducted surveillance, how his intelligence had enabled the attack. The Japanese public reaction was complex. Some saw Yoshikawa as a hero who had served his country brilliantly, who had accomplished an impossible intelligence mission, who deserved recognition that had been denied him. Others viewed him as a reminder of Japan's aggressive militarism, a figure associated with an attack that had led ultimately to national catastrophe. Yoshikawa himself was ambivalent about his wartime role. In interviews later in his life, he expressed pride in his professional accomplishment. He had done his job well, had served his country as he was trained to do. But he also acknowledged the human cost, the thousands who had died at Pearl Harbor and in the war that followed, the suffering on both sides. He resisted simple characterizations of his work as either heroic or villainous. He had been a soldier doing his duty. He hadn't started the war, hadn't made the decision to attack Pearl Harbor, hadn't controlled the events that followed. He had gathered intelligence as ordered. That was his contribution, no more and no less. In a 1991 interview, 2 years before his death, Yoshikawa reflected, "I did what my country asked of me. I was a professional, and I did my job professionally. But war is terrible, and the consequences of Pearl Harbor, for both our countries, were terrible. I don't regret doing my duty, but I can't celebrate the deaths that resulted from it either." The strategic assessment of Yoshikawa's intelligence work is complicated by the larger question of whether the Pearl Harbor attack was strategically wise for Japan. Tactically, the attack was brilliantly executed and achieved its immediate objectives. Yoshikawa's intelligence enabled that tactical success. But strategically, Pearl Harbor was arguably Japan's greatest mistake. The attack united American public opinion for war, transformed America from a divided nation, uncertain about involvement in foreign conflicts, into an angry nation determined to fight to total victory. It brought American industrial might fully into the war against Japan and Germany, and it guaranteed that the Pacific War would end only with Japan's complete defeat. Admiral Yamamoto himself understood this. His famous, though possibly apocryphal quote about awakening a sleeping giant reflected his understanding that attacking America would ultimately doom Japan. Yamamoto had lived in America, understood American industrial capacity, knew that if the war became a contest of production and attrition, Japan would lose. But Yamamoto believed that Japan's leadership had decided on war for political reasons he couldn't control. If war was inevitable, then striking first to cripple American naval power was the least bad option, and that strike required intelligence to be successful. From this perspective, Yoshikawa's intelligence work was professionally brilliant while serving a strategically doomed cause. He accomplished his mission perfectly, enabling a tactical triumph that contributed to strategic disaster. This paradox, perfect execution of a flawed strategy, characterized much of Japan's Pacific War effort. The intelligence tradecraft lessons from Yoshikawa's mission remain relevant decades later. His operation demonstrated several principles that intelligence services still study. Simplicity. Yoshikawa operated alone, without complex networks or elaborate schemes. This simplicity made him nearly impossible to detect. Complex operations have multiple points of failure. Yoshikawa's lone wolf approach eliminated most of those vulnerabilities. Patience. Yoshikawa spent 8 months gathering intelligence methodically. He didn't take shortcuts or unnecessary risks. He built comprehensive understanding through accumulation of small observations over time. Modern intelligence operations still emphasize this patient, methodical approach. Cover discipline. Yoshikawa maintained his cover as a diplomat consistently. Everything he did had plausible, innocent explanation. He never broke character, never gave American counterintelligence a clear reason to identify him as a spy. This discipline saved his life when American authorities interrogated him after Pearl Harbor. Operational security. Yoshikawa destroyed his notes, used secure communications, never recruited agents who could compromise him. His obsessive attention to security meant that even when Americans suspected he was a spy, they couldn't prove it. Cultural understanding. Yoshikawa understood American culture well enough to blend in, to recognize that American security culture was lax, to exploit American complacency. Intelligence operations in foreign environments require cultural intelligence as much as technical skills. These principles are taught in intelligence training programs today, with Yoshikawa's Pearl Harbor operation frequently cited as a case study in effective intelligence tradecraft. The ethical questions about what is intelligence-enabled don't diminish the professional quality of how he conducted the operation. For American counterintelligence, Yoshikawa's success was an indictment of pre-war security practices. The fact that a foreign spy could conduct 8 months of systematic surveillance of Pearl Harbor without being detected revealed profound security failures. American authorities should have conducted better surveillance of foreign diplomats, particularly those from potentially hostile nations, implemented tighter security around Pearl Harbor with larger perimeters and better protection of information. Been more suspicious of repeated visits to areas near military bases by foreign nationals. Recognized patterns in diplomatic communications that suggested intelligence gathering. Created better coordination between Navy intelligence, FBI counterintelligence, and local authorities. These lessons were learned, but only after Pearl Harbor. Post-war American counterintelligence was far more sophisticated, paranoid, and effective than pre-war efforts had been. Yoshikawa's success helped teach America that intelligence threats had to be taken seriously even in peacetime. The human dimension of Yoshikawa's story remains striking. He was a professional who did his job superbly well, serving a cause that history has judged harshly. He enabled an attack that killed thousands and started a war that killed millions. Yet he personally was not a war criminal, not an atrocity perpetrator, just an intelligence officer gathering information. How should history remember Takeo Yoshikawa? He wasn't a hero. His work enabled aggressive war and mass death. But he wasn't a villain either. He was a soldier following orders, doing what his country trained him to do, operating within the admittedly loose rules of intelligence warfare. Perhaps the most appropriate assessment is that Yoshikawa was a supremely competent professional who served a bad cause. His skills were remarkable. His dedication was absolute. His execution was nearly flawless. But skills, dedication, and execution in service of aggressive militarism don't deserve celebration regardless of their technical quality. Yoshikawa himself seemed to reach a similar conclusion. In his later years, he expressed respect for his American counterparts who had interrogated him in 1941–42, acknowledged the professionalism of American military forces despite being enemies, and expressed regret about the war itself while maintaining that he had simply done his duty as he understood it. He never apologized for his intelligence work. Apologizing would have meant betraying his professional identity and his service to his country. But he also never celebrated it or suggested it was heroic. He treated it as a job he had been trained to do, had done well, and had paid personal prices for afterward. Takeo Yoshikawa died on July 26, 1993 in Japan. He was 82 years old. His obituaries in Japanese newspapers mentioned his Pearl Harbor role, noting that he had been the spy who enabled the attack. But the obituaries were brief, and his death generated little public attention. He died as he had lived most of his post-war life, in relative obscurity, a man whose most important accomplishment had been kept secret for decades, and who never received recognition for work that had strategic consequences. His funeral was small, attended by family and a few friends. No Japanese government officials attended. No military honors were provided. The man whose intelligence had enabled Japan's greatest tactical victory of World War II was buried quietly, with minimal ceremony, his contribution to history acknowledged but not celebrated. This lack of recognition reflected post-war Japan's complicated relationship with its militarist past. The generation that had fought the war was seen by many younger Japanese as responsible for national catastrophe. Pearl Harbor, initially celebrated as a great victory, came to be viewed as the mistake that doomed Japan to defeat. Yoshikawa, as the intelligence officer who enabled Pearl Harbor, was associated with that mistake. But among intelligence professionals, both in Japan and internationally, Yoshikawa's reputation was secure. He had conducted one of the most successful intelligence operations in history, had gathered the information needed for a major military operation, and had done so without being detected or compromised. From a purely professional standpoint, setting aside the ethical questions about what his intelligence enabled, Yoshikawa's Pearl Harbor mission was exemplary. The lasting impact of Yoshikawa's work extends beyond the immediate Pearl Harbor attack. His intelligence influenced Japanese naval tactics throughout the early Pacific War. His reports on American defensive weaknesses encouraged Japanese forces to conduct surprise attacks at multiple locations. His success demonstrated that even powerful nations could be vulnerable to patient, methodical intelligence gathering by individual operatives. For the United States, Yoshikawa's success was a wake-up call about intelligence and counterintelligence. Pearl Harbor wasn't just a failure of military preparedness, it was a failure of intelligence and counterintelligence. The fact that a single Japanese spy could gather comprehensive intelligence on America's most important Pacific base without being detected revealed systemic weaknesses that had to be addressed. Post-war American intelligence and counterintelligence were rebuilt with the Pearl Harbor experience in mind. The CIA was created partly because pre-war intelligence coordination had been inadequate. FBI counterintelligence operations were expanded and professionalized. Military security around bases was dramatically tightened. The assumption that America was protected by geography and that foreign spies couldn't operate effectively on American soil was permanently abandoned. In this sense, Yoshikawa's intelligence success, while harmful to the United States in the short term, ultimately contributed to creating the intelligence and counterintelligence systems that helped America win the Cold War. The lessons learned from his operation made America more security conscious and more sophisticated about intelligence threats. The moral questions about Yoshikawa's work remain unresolved. Was he a spy who enabled aggressive war and mass death, or was he a professional doing his duty? Was his work criminally harmful or simply military intelligence that every nation conducts? Should he be condemned for serving Japanese militarism or respected for professional competence regardless of the cause served? There are no simple answers. Yoshikawa served a regime that committed atrocities, that waged aggressive war, that caused suffering across Asia and the Pacific. His intelligence work enabled that regime's military operations. But Yoshikawa himself didn't commit atrocities, didn't order aggressive war, didn't directly cause suffering. He gathered information. What others did with that information was not within his control. Perhaps the most balanced assessment is that Yoshikawa was a talented professional who served a bad cause, that his technical competence doesn't deserve celebration, but his personal conduct doesn't deserve condemnation either. He was a small part of a larger system, doing his part without controlling the system's larger direction or moral character. This assessment applies to many individuals who served Axis powers during World War II. Soldiers who fought bravely for bad causes, civilians who supported regimes they didn't fully understand, professionals who applied their skills without confronting the ethical implications. History judges the causes harshly while often taking more nuanced views of individuals who served those causes without being major decision-makers or atrocity perpetrators. Takeo Yoshikawa was such an individual. He wasn't a Nazi concentration camp guard or a Japanese officer who committed war crimes. He was an intelligence operative who gathered information about enemy military capabilities. That's a normal military function, conducted by all sides in every war. The fact that his intelligence enabled a surprise attack that started a major war makes his role more consequential than typical intelligence work. But it doesn't fundamentally change the moral category his actions fall into. He was a spy gathering military intelligence, an adversary to Allied forces but not a war criminal. The story of Takeo Yoshikawa matters today because it illustrates several enduring truths about intelligence, war, and history. It shows that individuals can have strategic impact through professional competence, even when serving flawed causes. It demonstrates that intelligence failures can have catastrophic consequences. American counterintelligence failures allowed Yoshikawa to operate freely, contributing to the Pearl Harbor disaster. It reveals the human costs of war that extend far beyond battlefields. Yoshikawa paid personal prices for his wartime service, losing his career, his marriage, his financial security, spending decades in obscurity for work he couldn't discuss. The thousands who died at Pearl Harbor paid the ultimate price, but Yoshikawa paid too, in different ways, for the rest of his life. And it raises questions about recognition and celebration of military accomplishments. Should Yoshikawa have been celebrated as a hero by Japan? His work was professionally brilliant, but enabled aggressive war. Should he have been condemned as a criminal? His work was harmful to Allied interests, but was legitimate military intelligence gathering. The fact that he was neither celebrated as a hero nor condemned as a criminal, but instead lived in obscurity with his accomplishments classified and later acknowledged but not honored, seems appropriate. He was a professional who did his job well in service of a cause that history has judged negatively. Recognition of his professional competence is warranted. Celebration of his contribution to Japanese militarism is not. In the end, Takeo Yoshikawa was the spy who enabled Pearl Harbor, one man whose 8 months of patient, methodical intelligence gathering provided the information that allowed Japan to execute the most successful surprise attack in modern naval history. His work was technically brilliant, strategically consequential, and ultimately contributed to starting a war that destroyed the regime he served. That paradox, perfect execution of a mission that contributed to larger strategic disaster, is Yoshikawa's legacy. He accomplished exactly what he was sent to accomplish, did it better than anyone could have reasonably expected, and the result was tactical triumph that enabled strategic catastrophe. The spy they called a hero in the 1960s after decades of official silence. The spy who was never prosecuted despite enabling an attack that killed thousands. The spy who drove a taxi in post-war Tokyo, his greatest accomplishment classified and unknown. The spy who died in obscurity in 1993, his story told but not celebrated, acknowledged but not honored. Takeo Yoshikawa, the man who enabled Pearl Harbor through patience, precision, and professional intelligence tradecraft. A reminder that history is made by individuals whose contributions are complex, whose legacies are ambiguous, whose lives don't fit simple narratives of heroes and villains, but instead exist in moral gray areas where duty, profession, and consequences conflict in ways that defy easy judgment. His story deserves to be told not to celebrate what he accomplished, but to understand it, to learn from his tradecraft, to recognize how intelligence failures create catastrophic vulnerabilities, to appreciate the human complexity of individuals caught up in historic events larger than themselves, serving causes they didn't choose in ways they were trained to serve. The spy who enabled Pearl Harbor. The professional who did his job perfectly. The man who paid personal prices for success in service of a doomed cause. The forgotten figure whose technical competence changed history, while his personal story remained unknown for decades. That is Takeo Yoshikawa's story. A story of intelligence, war, consequence, and the strange fate of being professionally successful while personally forgotten. Of accomplishing a mission that enabled tactical triumph and strategic disaster. Of serving a cause history condemned while maintaining professional dignity that even enemies acknowledged. A story worth remembering, not for celebration, but for understanding. The spy who enabled Pearl Harbor. One man, 8 months, perfect execution of a mission that changed history and destroyed the nation he served.